Alongside patch 7.1.0 and the launch of Season of the Deep, Bungie buffed a number of exotic armor pieces. One of these being Chromatic Fire. Now, ever since its release in 2018 with Forsaken, it has been deemed by the community as being very okay. Granted, that didn't stop us from literally making a build every opportunity we could with Chromatic Fire. The explosions! Now, back then when it launched, Chromatic Fire's original exotic perk stated that precision final blows from kinetic weapons create an explosion that deals damage in the element of your subclass. So sure, it was a pretty fun neutral game exotic with some fun interactions with weapons like Ace of Spades and Outbreak Perfected, but its explosions were too small and did too little damage to warrant using Chromatic over a lot of other stronger exotic options. Now though, after its buff, Chromatic Fire is looking interesting enough to warrant its own video. So today, we're going to be taking a look at what this new version has to offer. In PvE, after its buff, Chromatic Fire's explosion has been buffed to deal increased damage in an increased radius. Immediately, this already makes Chromatic feel a lot better. Its explosion was insignificant enough previously to not feel like it ever made much of a difference in your neutral game. It was alright. More explosions are never a bad thing. The only cases that really made it stand out was when it was mixed with a weapon that already had some sort of AoE kill proc effect, like a weapon with Firefly, Outbreak Perfected with Sleeping Nanites. Now though, the explosions increased damage and radius feels a lot more forgiving. Since we've power crept the sandbox so hard with perks like Volt Shot and Incandescence, this buff helps Chromatic feel like it can finally stand up against the more meta choices for ad clear AoE perks. Now, one of the biggest pain points about Chromatic Fire in the past was that while it was a fun exotic to use, there was really no point bringing it into in-game content. The explosions were too insignificant to make that much of a mark on enemies, and activities like GM Nightfalls and other exotic armor pieces just simply brought more utility to your loadout than what Chromatic could. After the Chromatic buff though, Crystalline Transistor now also states that precision final blows from kinetic weapons create an explosion that deals damage in the element of your subclass, but most notably also applies elemental effects. This is huge. These elemental effects that the explosion applies changes depending on the subclass you're using. For Arc, it applies Blind. For Solar, it applies Scorch. For Void, it applies Weaken. For Stasis, it applies Slow. And for Strand, it applies Sever. So not only did the explosion's damage and radius get buffed, but it now has a whole new added aspect of utility too. And this utility is exactly what was needed to help bring this previously underused exotic into the limelight for content where the explosions might not be hitting hard enough to fully defeat enemies surrounding it. In lower end content, you probably won't get too much use out of them due to most surrounding ads simply dying to initial explosions. But these additional lingering effects are really nice for the occasional few ads that maybe didn't fully die to the initial explosion, plus all the secondary benefits that dip into our subclasses. That being said, while some of these new elemental effects are a little more potent than others, all of them really do seem to be very strong, and they work as expected here. Any enemy that was damaged by the explosion but is still left alive will in turn be affected by one of the elemental status effects. Now keep in mind, the status effect and its radius is the same as the explosion radius. So unfortunately, you can't kill something with an Arc subclass equipped and having an entire section of a room blinded in a similar radius to that of like a special nade launcher with disorienting grenades. However, the Arc explosion's blinding effect is surprisingly potent. While not the flashiest of all the subclass verbs, no pun intended, blind can be a lifesaver in in-game content. Now the stasis slow effect acts pretty similar to the blind effect. It's not the strongest, but it is a good way of providing some extra crowd control while you're clearing ads. The Strand Severing effect is pretty good. The lowering damage output for many enemies affected by Sever does help to keep you alive, and it can be surprisingly powerful when combined with the Warlock Strand aspect, Mind Spun Invocation, and Shackle Grenades, where after consuming your grenades, final blows create a suspending detonation. Now, if you eat your grenade and get a precision kill in a group of ads, the Suspend and Sever help take care of any other ads that weren't taken out by the initial explosion. Now, the new strength of the buff's Chromatic Fire doesn't stop there, as the Void Weakening and Solar Scorch effects are very solid options. One of the main reasons that the Solar Scorching effect is so strong is because how it can finish off ads that weren't previously killed by Chromatic's explosion. Did you just kill an enemy slightly too far from the one next to it, leaving that other one just a sliver of health? No problem, as the Scorch will finish them off after a few ticks. Now from our testing, it didn't seem like the explosion was adding enough Scorch stacks to trigger consistent ignitions. But just like Incandescent, the ability to apply AoE Scorching effect can be surprisingly useful in PvE content. And for those of you who simply just want more raw damage, the Void Weakening debuff that you can get from Chromatic Fire is quite nasty, as when you get a precision kill on an enemy, any enemy touched by the explosion will be granted the standard 15% weakening debuff. And not only does it help clear out ads, but it can help with tank your enemies too. In activities like Nightfalls, where you're fighting red bars alongside enemies like champions and hype guardians, all it takes is just getting one headshot on a stray ad to debuff those bigger targets. And even past all the practicality, it just feels really good to be getting so many yellow numbers on your screen. Now, what are the best options to pair with Chromatic Fire? Well, we have a number of them. Again, the only requirement here is they have to be kinetic. Not Stasis, not Strand, kinetic. Ace of Spades is one of the best pairings with Chromatic Fire, as you're going to be getting a weapon with Momentum Mori and that damage boost, ad clearing potential all on its own, and then the subclass functionality on top of it. Bungie also confirmed here recently that a major hand cannon buff will be coming in the last TWAB, so Ace with Chromatic is only going to get nastier. The double explosions are pretty addicting. Keep in mind though, that elemental explosion is more delayed. So the Firefly explosion goes off first, and then the elemental explosion. Now, as we discussed in our Season 21 builds video, Outbreak Perfected is also one of the best weapons to pair with Chromatic Fire. If you run it with a Void subclass, each headshot you get will both weaken nearby enemies and spawn Siva nanites. So guys, that means that any enemies that end up living after the initial explosion just get finished off by the Siva nanites. And again, weakening a tankier target, you can literally just aim right at them with Outbreak Perfected and shred them down. Now keep in mind, this is not just limited to the Void subclass. These weapons are still very good when paired with other subclasses, so feel free to dip into those. Now, another weapon that I want to throw on this list is Wishender. Guys, we have actually done deep dives on Wishender. We've made builds on Wishender. Wishender is very good, and I love Wishender with Oathkeepers after the rework to Oathkeepers. Feel free to check out that review. However, you can pair it here with Chromatic, and in some ways, that may actually be better, because a lot of people say that Wishender does a great single target damage, but its ad clearing capabilities is terrible. Well, looky there, guys. Chromatic Fire is perfect for this. Now, as we've spoken about PvE throughout the majority of this video, we need to talk about PvP. Is Chromatic Fire in PvP meta? In most cases, no. There are plenty of other Warlock exotics that offer a lot more utility than Chromatic Fire, and this is coming from someone who literally made Chromatic Fire builds every opportunity I could. In fact, something we have missed is that Chromatic Fire's explosion damage in PvP actually received a major nerf this season. You see, previously, Chromatic's explosion inside of PvP would deal 208 damage max if enemies were shoulder to shoulder. This allowed you to get the multi-kill, even on max resilience guardians. Now, it only does 101 damage max, and its damage drop-off starts around 3 meters. I cannot stress how significant of a nerf this actually is, and Bungie, you have got to include this kind of stuff in the patch notes. I also think that the nerf was really unjustified. Nobody was really jumping up saying Chromatic Fire was meta inside of PvP. It was really just a fun exotic, and it required your enemies to be literally on top of each other. And even when we pair damage like Firefly with Chromatic Fire from another weapon, you still can't get the one-hit kill. This is a brutal nerf, and what's even more surprising about all of this is that it was never included in the patch notes. This was bundled up, packaged, and sent to us as if it was an overall blanket buff, PvE and PvP. So for my PvP users that are using Chromatic Fire and you're scratching your head wondering, why am I not getting the one-hit kill? Well, that's why. And I know Bungie's gonna say it's because the new status effects from Chromatic can apply inside of PvP now, and that's why it's gonna be so good. And like, don't get me wrong, I like the status effects. Yes, you could take advantage of Weaken, Scorch, you could potentially blind some enemies inside of PvP, although let's be real, they have to be pretty much on top of each other for it to be in full effect. But let me ask you, would you prefer these status effects inside of PvP, or would you just prefer that 208 damage for the multi-kill? And I guess I'm a little spoiled here, but I would actually prefer both. I think something we constantly complain about inside of PvP is hand-holding, and I love exotics that can really push enemies apart. And despite Chromatic Fire never really being the meta, it definitely was an exotic that made enemies separate from each other. Now finally, I want us to talk about the two biggest powerhouses when combined with Outbreak, Stasis and Strand. Now starting with Stasis, the slow provided by Chromatic's explosion is surprisingly strong. It's your normal slowing effect that won't let you sprint, and it lasts for surprisingly long interval of 6 seconds. One thing to note, Whisper of Durance, the stasis fragment that increases any of your slow timer, does not work here, as we're getting a 6-second slow timer both with and without our testing. And what makes this so strong with Outbreak is that now, with the slow, it will be a lot harder for enemies to run away from your nanites. As long as they took a decent amount of damage from that initial explosion, it should be significantly harder to run away from those nanites, which will result in more nanite kills. Lastly, we need to talk about Strand. When you build into Strand with, say, something like Outbreak and Chromatic, it can become, put it simply, disgusting. On its own, the severing effect can be pretty underwhelming. It might help net you a few cleanups or make a few more tangles, but that's it. But once you combine it with Mind Spun Invocation, which allows you to create a suspending burst on takedowns after eating your shackle grenade, Strand's power spikes immensely when you eat your grenade and get a kill. Not only is anyone next to your target damaged by the explosion, but they're also left completely immobile, essentially just waiting to be devoured by your Siva nanites. Sure, this build will be relying on your grenade's cooldown to be truly effective, but we've actually done builds like this before. Osteostriga, Necrotic Grips, Consumer on grenades. It's disgusting. And even here with Chromatic Fire, it's still popping off. So all in all, is Chromatic Fire now meta? Well, its new buff does give it plenty of potential and allows this exotic to shine a lot more than it ever could before, at least inside of PvE. PvP though, it has been slapped to the ground. Sure, you can still make it work, but personally, I think this was a terrible nerf for PvP. As for my PvE users though, I think you're gonna be very pleased, and we have a number of kinetic options that are just waiting for you to utilize alongside Chromatic Fire. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.